My name is Matthew Leffler. I am a 2010 graduate of the Law College. I have been practicing law for the last 10 or so years. I'm so excited to invite you all to join us in person and virtually today. I am thrilled that so many people have expressed interest in understanding the law and supply chain. You can't opt out of the supply chain. It is everywhere. Just last week, we saw him last week tonight, John Oliver talking about the challenges of being a truck driver. And this industry is only getting more competitive. So it spans across the globe. The way that we buy things is changing. People believe in just-in-time fulfillment. And to make just-in-time fulfillment work, you need a supply chain that is humming along at every single level. It's great when things are perfect. It struggles when things buckle up. And because we have such a massive need for so many things, supply chain touches every single one of us. We support manufacturing, distribution, and retail and fulfillment. Trillions of dollars of goods and services are part of our supply chain. So this is why the MSU Law College is pleased to host this discussion with industry-leading experts in electric vehicle manufacturing, retail, maritime, and consumer product manufacturing. Let's talk about these panelists. They're amazing. First, I have Lauren Began. I adore Lauren. She is phenomenal. She's a seasoned maritime industry expert with extensive experience in ocean-borne commerce and maritime law, with specific emphasis on federal regulatory matters, ocean and surface transportation, international antitrust law specific to maritime, and port and terminal operations. You understand, everybody, when you're talking about ocean freight, there's like 10 companies that do all of it. And this is something that we don't really understand in the US supply chain. We are fragmented in the US supply chain. In the global transportation, it's a little bit different. Now, Ms. Began is a principal and founder of Squall Strategies, LLC, a maritime consulting firm specializing in federal regulatory matters, shipping, compliance, and cargo issues, general maritime law, and foreign trade and tariff matters. Prior to Squall Strategies, Ms. Began held positions with the Federal Maritime Commission, the Port of Boston at Massachusetts Port Authority, the U.S. Department of State, and the Massachusetts Port, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg, Germany. Das ist ausgezeichnet. Next, we have an MSU Law alumni, Michael Kaiser. Mr. Kaiser is an in-house attorney who specializes in information technology, transactional agreements, capital investment, and security and strategy. For those who don't really know, the future that we see in transportation is about ACEs, autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And in that electrification, in that autonomous space, it's chasing what drives cost for transportation. In transportation, there are essentially four things that is all your money goes to. The first one is fuel. That's your most expensive thing in transportation. The second most expensive thing is the labor, the human beings that move things and move them around across the country. The next one is the asset itself, the truck, the trailer, whatever else. Distant fourth is, the maintenance, and then finally insurance and the tires. Mr. Kaiser is Associate General Counsel for May Mobility, which is a company committed to transforming cities through autonomous technology and to create a safer, greener, and more accessible world. Prior to working for May Mobility, Mr. Kaiser was the Associate General Counsel for Rivian, the startup company based in Central Illinois. Rivian, for those who don't know, their first customer was Amazon. Amazon invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Rivian, followed shortly after that by Ford and Cox Automotive. This world of changing our transportation infrastructure requires incredible legal aptitude. Our next panelist is a very good friend that I've just recently met, another alumni, Evelyn Smith. Evelyn is the Director of Legal Counsel at Dell Technologies, supporting global logistics, fulfillment, and trade, and supply chain assurance organizations. She manages a team of logistics lawyers located in, I'm going to do my best here, Evelyn, Bratislava,
Slovakia.
Hey, thank you. Now, Ms. Smith's legal experience includes in-house leadership roles at Volkswagen Group America, Mettler Toledo International Incorporated, and DHL Supply Chain. For those who don't know a lot about DHL, they were formerly Airborne. Hello, Grace. It's so good to see you. We are excited, everybody, because here's the thing. Supply chain is all the things, and law is all of the things. If you want to be an attorney, you will have to understand supply chain because it affects every single one of your clients. Now, I am pleased to turn it over to our moderator for today's conversation, Dennis Kennedy. Dennis Kennedy is the professor at the Center for Law, Technology, and Innovation. I lost my place, and author of the recent book, Successful Innovation Outcomes in Law. Professor Kennedy is retired as senior counsel for digital payments and labs at MasterCard. He is a well-known author, speaker, and law professor, blogger, and co-host of the Kennedy Mile podcast on legal technology and former chair of the ABA Legal Technology Resource Center Board. He's at Dennis Kennedy on Twitter, and his new book is co-authored by Tom Mile. The Collaboration Tools and Technologies will be published this summer. I am so excited that we got to this place. For years, I have been in the supply chain. I practiced privately, but I moved into what we now look at as supply chain law and supply chain generally. To make this panel happen today, it was an effort of the entire law community. And I'm so excited that we were able to get this across the finish line. Some of the people we have to thank is the Center for Law, Technology, and Innovation, the Elliott Spoon Business and Securities Law Institute. Briefly, Professor Spoon has retired. I adore Elliott Spoon. He taught me contracts law. He taught me so much, and I'm so glad that his organization is part of this. The Spartans in Business and Law Association, the MSU Law Alumni Association Student Outreach Committee. This is the committee that I serve on. I am so glad that I could be part of the Alumni Association to bring this level of quality speakers from all across the area to you today. Finally, the MSU Law Career Services Office and the Law Advancement Team. Pause for applause. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I never expected this. Without further ado, I am so excited to turn it over to Professor Kennedy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank Matt especially for bringing all his obvious energy into this project and really moving it forward. And to all the people who were involved, Danielle, Michelle, other students, there were all kinds of people, and it has been great to work together. I realized on my way here this morning that once you start thinking in terms of supply chain, you see the supply chains, I'll use the pearls everywhere. And in a way, to get us all here for this webinar, there was a supply chain that we had to make work in a lot of different ways with a lot of moving parts. And so it's interesting as you start to think about the world in terms of supply chains, and as we've seen it disrupted from time to time. So we're going to dive in. We're going to talk both about what this role is, how people got there, some of the issues out there, and why this is becoming now a really interesting area of practice for lawyers, and how we're seeing students come out of the law school who are going right into supply chain law. So it's a fascinating time, and it's sort of top of mind for all of us because of our own experiences with the supply chain, both positive and negative. So I want to start with the panelists, and I guess what I'll do is kind of take you in the order that I see you on my screen. So I'll start with you, Michael. I'm guessing that you didn't go to law school with the idea of becoming a supply chain lawyer. So tell us about how you got from there to where you are now.
Sure, thank you, Dennis, I appreciate it. No, did not go to law school with the idea of being a supply chain or involved in supply chain whatsoever. I went to school a little older. I was 30 when I started Michigan State. When I left Michigan State, I did something that I thought I wanted to do for a career, and that was criminal law. I worked for a brief time with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office in homicide, and worked a little bit with U.S. Attorney's Office. And you're thinking probably, how did you get to supply chain from there? A lot of stuff in the middle, but I realized technology was really the future, and a place where I could make a difference and there was a need. So a lot of outside of the classroom studying, which I didn't enjoy, a lot of outside work studying, which wasn't a lot of fun, but eventually worked my way into a position with a small startup in Detroit that is subsequently went under, but started to cut my teeth there, and then was fortunate to get a job at Ford Motor Company. They had started a transactional IT group, which was started with 4 or 5, grew into 20. So I worked there for 4.5 years and really learned, cut my teeth at Ford Motor Company. Then the opportunity came for me to move to Rivian Automotive. So at the time, Rivian was based in Plymouth. I reached out to them. I was the 4th attorney hired at Rivian. And that went from cutting my teeth to like being thrown into a hurricane. Being the 4th attorney, we had plants, we had retail that we're talking about doing. They were talking about charging stations, talking about clothing, talking about service stations, service centers and things. So I had a whirlwind experience there. And then I moved over now to our May Mobility, where we are working to provide autonomous rides, ridership for vehicles. We partner with Toyota right now, and we've given over 400,000 rides, safe, incident-free rides to people across the country in our hub locations. So all of this came together. I have some automotive, I have some technology, and it was just simply recognizing that there was a gap in the industry. There was a place for me to go, and that was in the technology field. So dumb luck, fortunate timing, and maybe 1 or 2 good decisions got me here.
Right. I'm just going to acknowledge that Britton has joined us, and we'll introduce him in a minute as we kind of revolve over to him on the questions. But let's go to Lauren, who has the interesting title there of the maritime professor. So I heard before this that maybe you went to law school with the idea of becoming a maritime lawyer, which makes you probably like 1 in a million of law students. But kind of tell us how you got from law school to what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I was one of 3 in my law graduating class so Lauren Began. I am from Michigan originally. I'm from Traverse City. Went to Hope College, started sailing on the sail team at Hope College, and thought, I kind of like this. At the time, I was going into international political science and was trying to figure out a way of turning that into not just having to go straight to DC, and found this law school out in Rhode Island called Roger Williams University School of Law. And I had a joint degree program with University of Rhode Island, which was a master's in marine affairs. So I thought, great, I can go and I can just get to talk about boats all day. So I went out there, and the joint degree program, like I said, only had 2 other students in it. So the 3 of us came out, and I can tell you one of them does healthcare law now. So she didn't even get to stay, unfortunately, in the maritime industry. But yeah, so I sought out to go for maritime affairs. I always knew that I wanted to enjoy the subject matter. And so I've taken roles throughout my career that may or may not have actually had legal leanings to them. I've certainly been in general counsel offices, but then I've also been in a little more operationally leaning or business development leaning positions. But understanding the maritime basis and understanding kind of the ocean transport side of things has really lended itself well to being able to move within the industry. Even as we talk today, supply chain, maritime is just one piece of that. And I mean, slice that even further down, and then you start to talk about different areas of maritime. So coming out, even though you're kind of targeting, when you go to law school, you kind of target certain areas, you kind of fear, what if I do start targeting? It makes it a little bit easier to maybe find that first job. So I came out of law school in 2009 when basically nobody could find a job anywhere. And because I came out speaking the language of maritime, because in itself, it's a language, it gave me a little bit of a leg up because, okay, well, I'm not necessarily entry level, even though I certainly was a brand new attorney. I had a little bit more of that oomph of I knew what the language was. So, similarly, if you supply chain, if you speak that language, whether you slice it directly down to maritime or if you stay in supply chain, it's only going to help you because you're going to come out speaking that language of the law.
And then Evelyn, we've had some great conversations in the past, but you are at Dell, which is, to me, one of the real pioneers in the sort of just-in-time global supply chain. So, and I'm guessing that you two also didn't go to law school with the idea of becoming a supply chain lawyer. So maybe you could talk about your path as well.
Yeah, that is true. I was actually at Michigan State undergrad, and as you know, the undergraduate supply chain program is premier, and I overlooked it entirely. So missed that window to really get in from the ground floor. But after graduating law school, I was primarily a labor and employment lawyer. I started out with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, transitioned to Clark Hill, a law firm where I was a hybrid of employment and commercial litigation. And then really got my feet wet as I moved from the private practice area to in-house with my first role with Volkswagen of America. So that was sort of tranche one of supply chain, in that I supported the distribution area, parts and service distribution. So just sort of getting my footing on sort of what happens in warehouses, and being able to walk through warehouses with your yellow jacket on and all of that. Then I moved from, I was in Michigan at the time, and I started out my practice in Michigan, but then moved to Ohio with a company called Mettler Toledo, an international company that's based in Switzerland. And then kind of floated to the production side of things, as well as sales. So again, another component of the supply chain that's very important. If we don't produce anything, there's nothing to, to supply. And then from there, I moved to DHL Supply Chain, which is the 3PL arm of it, where we were doing warehousing for any number of industries, retail, medical, and consumer-based products. So that all culminated really into the role that I have with Dell Technologies as a shipper, and using in all modes of transportation with our global footprint. I now see everything, and so I was chuckling before we began with Lauren just about just the ocean portion of what I have to focus on. And certainly I'm delighted to meet her now, because of I often need some assistance with those areas that come, but I kind of cover it all now with our footprint and our very sophisticated supply chain that moves our products across the globe.
Great. And Britton, I'm so glad we got you joined with us. And I do not want to deprive you of the fantastic introduction that I know Matt has prepared for you. So I'm going to call him up to do that.
Britton, it's so good to see you. I am a huge fan. Again, I have known Britton for a few years now. I have followed him, and I urge everyone who is watching at home or is in this room now, these are all people you should follow, connect with, learn about what they do. Britton Ladd, my goodness. I first met this man, I first learned about him from an article my brother sent me from Forbes, talking about strategic entry deterrence of retailers in the United States. When I talk about supply chain, I talk about products and I talk about retail, because the product and how that product gets to you are the same thing. It is part of the value proposition. So for over 20 years, Britton Ladd has been in the supply chain management and logistics space. He has lived and worked in China, India, Africa, Saudi Arabia, Europe, and the United States. Britton is a global strategy and supply chain consultant and a writer for Forbes and his own website, brittonladd.com. Britton's articles are among the most popular of any writer on the topics of retail, rapid grocery fulfillment and delivery, and micro-fulfillment, and supply chain management. The path today is ever faster, ever quicker to get the things that you want, the SKUs now. Now, Mr. Ladd is the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Kucher Pulse Integration, KPI. In his position, he maintains executive leadership over supply chain management, as well as the teams are located for large retail, manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, and defense, mining, and logistics companies. Mr. Ladd is frequently quoted in the press and often appears in news outlets like Fox News, CNN, Cheddar to discuss business and supply chain management. Prior to working at KPI, Mr. Ladd held positions at Amazon, Deloitte, Dell Technologies, and I'm going to butcher this name, Britton, so please correct me. Capgemini? Does that sound right?
Correct. It's a
Okay.
consulting firm out of France.
And he's always specializing in supply chain and global trade. What I'm so excited about with this group of individuals is the eclectic nature of their backgrounds, their passion for how law functions in their respective fields, and the fact that everything is supply chain. Back to you, sir.
There you go. See, it's totally worth it. So Britt, what I've been asking people is to say, how did you get from, your career is sort of been in supply chain. So maybe as a youngster, you always had this notion that you're going to get into supply chain. I suspect not, but sort of how did you go from, where you started to kind of where you are now, and what were some of the drivers in that?
Well, the reason I'm walking around is I'm trying to find to where I could hear you without breaking up. So it's interesting. My background really, in terms of a career, really began in the Marine Corps. So by serving in the Marines and traveling globally, I really was able to see logistics firsthand from a military point of view. And it just fascinated me. And unfortunately, I had gotten wounded and I had to get out of the Marines, but I went to college, earned a bachelor's degree, began my career working for FedEx, and from there began to get exposed to different levels of supply chain, logistics, transportation, fulfillment, warehousing, and really fell in love with it. Decided to start earning degrees. I went on to earn 3 master's degrees, and one of them is a master's of science from Penn State University in supply chain. And I just started putting myself in positions to where I could really work in supply chain. So working at the retailer Michael's stores, I led a 5-year transformation there. Some executives from Dell read a case study that Yale University wrote about some of the things I did at Michael's, and they recruited me to Dell. I stayed with Dell for 3 years. I ran their global supply chain. Love Dell. Absolutely still love the company. And I became a consultant focused on supply chain at Deloitte. And I was working globally, working across different industries. And the more that I worked in these different industries, the more I realized how sophisticated and complicated and important supply chain really is. And then along the way, I started to write about supply chain. And I started to intentionally go after professors in supply chain who were constantly writing articles and in my opinion, were doing a disservice to supply chain because they kept talking about optimization. And they kept talking about technology. And I came to the conclusion from my time at Deloitte and at Capgemini, and eventually I went to Amazon, but prior to Amazon, I came to the conclusion that really a supply chain, in my opinion, exists for one reason and one reason only: to enable growth. That's it. The only reason why a company needs a supply chain is to enable their growth. And when you think of it from that perspective, it really does change how you view the supply chain. And when I got to Amazon, I began to push Amazon to think of doing things differently. I was to recommend Amazon to acquire Whole Foods. And that wasn't just a retail decision. That was a big supply chain decision. And so I've just continued to put myself in positions where I'm learning from others in supply chain. I still work globally, but I just love supply chain. Dearly, dearly love it. It's still one of the topics I enjoy working in and speaking of.
This is great. And for people who have the chance to see the recording again, it's worth kind of running through this again, because this is a gold mine of career tips. If you just sort of listen to the things that people did and how they pivoted in their careers and kind of followed these things. So I think every day now, it seems like, and hopefully not during this seminar, that we see disruptions of the supply chain. We see how important it is. And, you know, we think of the ships, we think of semi trucks, we think of, you know, the delivery to the door, all these different things, but we tend not to even realize, I think most people, that lawyers play a role. And so I think that would be really instructive for people, is to hear from you, like, how and where do lawyers fit into the supply chain these days? So let me go, I guess, basically in the same order. So Michael, if I can start with you.
Sure. So, you know, my experience working I'll use Rivian as an example, in startup environment. I was joined with the hip with our supply chain folks. We needed to talk about the obvious, the contracting, but we needed to talk about strategy, right? And because we had a number of factors, right? We were going to be manufacturing, so there was a tremendous scale that we needed to consider. We had a number of existing vendors to prove out the technology and build models and things, but it's a far cry from a 1 or 2 or 10 piece company giving you a piece of software, hardware to work with for demo purposes, to test these things, to scale that up. So we were there every day, every step of the way, from the negotiation, beginning of the negotiation, but before that, the RFP process. Before that, discussed who the RFPs or RFIs would go out to. Could we go for a leading industry company? Would they give us the time of day, right? Where would we fit on their production schedule? Rivian needs 5,000 of these, GM needs 500,000. You could see that we wouldn't get necessarily the attention we'd want. So there was the analysis. What surprised me about this, because I was intimately involved with it at Rivian, was I knew it was out there, but the amount of scholarship and the amount of information to make these decisions, right? You had seasoned veterans back in the day who worked at GM and Ford, and I'm sure they knew the 6 or 10 people who could make a number of screws or bolts. And if you didn't do it fast enough, they would just pivot and go to the next person. And, an industry grew up around Michigan that way. Obviously, we're global and multinational. So the idea of having backup suppliers and how you fit in production schedules, I learned a ton about what that meant for me as a contracting attorney, right? Things to look for when I was talking with these vendors and their attorneys, because I wasn't up to speed, right? If you're selling parts to OEMs and I'm talking to a counsel on the other side, that person's going to know more about the business than I do, right? No question, no doubt. That's their livelihood. How I made up for a lot of that gap, I hope, was by working with my supply chain folks, working with the procurement folks, and those professionals educating me so I could be a better lawyer for them. And we were together every single day at Rivian.
Great. How about you, Lauren?
Sure. So, I would say that there's a couple different ways that lawyers fit in. So, I started a consulting company about a year ago called Squall Strategies. And, part of what I do there is really help with the regulatory world. So I used to work at the Federal Maritime Commission in Washington, D.C., which really, they're the regulators of the ocean industry. So not the surface side of supply chain. I'm the water side of supply chain. And so what I did there was really learned everything from a very helicopter level about what the industry was doing. And so that was, helping to implement some of the laws that Congress might have passed. And it might have been, I was our international affairs attorney. So I was translating and negotiating with some of our international partners across the world, obviously, for our multilateral, bilateral. If it was a big enough discussion, the politicals would usually go, but sometimes they were smaller discussions and it was just me and Department of State and Department of Transportation and Maritime Administration. So it was like the three of us. I really at an early age was able to get some real good experience. And then I moved up to the Port of Boston and got my boots on the docks and saw what all of that regulation looked like. And so when I created the consulting company, I wanted to be back part of that national conversation. And so what do I do with the consulting company? The regulatory world has come back to me. So it's applying specific questions that companies, individuals, whoever it is, has about the law. And so it's translation. And so that's the second piece that I think that lawyers fill that role in supply chain generally, is translating what's happening out there. Because if lawyers talk to lawyers, that's great, but nobody else is really learning much from that. And so being able to translate what the regs say. And so that's more than just reading the black letter law, reading the CFRs from the agencies or the statutes from the Congress, but it's really predicting and kind of analyzing what's going on. So what are the legislators doing? What is Congress doing? Right now, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act is going through. I mean, arguably, the first version that went through the House wasn't well understood by even some of the lawmakers. You know, some of the pieces that they put in there were things that the Federal Maritime Commission already had authority to do. So it's like, okay, well, that's great that you're reinforcing, you know, current authority, but you're reinforcing current authority here. The Senate version was a much better version. You know, there's still pieces here and there, but it's still a much better version, just passed through the Senate as well. And so, you know, translating that, being able to understand what is happening, those nuances, and translating that to the public. And what are the regulators doing and saying? What is the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, doing? What is MARAD doing? They're less of a regulatory body, but they still have a very important role. Department of Transportation and Maritime Administration, they still have a very important role in the maritime industry and through the ports. So, you know, that's actually the other piece of my name here is the Maritime Professor. I'll be launching an e-learning platform really shortly that will really kind of help translate, because not everybody actually has that law question. But I've found a lot of people just want to know what's going on. You know, whether it's you're on these extravagant yachts and you want to be able to chit chat about maritime, or more likely, if you really want to just kind of stand out in your working role and, you know, you're in the supply chain, maybe you're on the surface side and you kind of want to understand a little bit more about the ocean side. So, you know, that I would say that those are the most two important areas that I see is regulatory analysis, but also regulatory translation for lawyers in the supply chain world.
Oh, interesting. So Evelyn, where do you see lawyers fitting into the whole supply chain process?
Sure. Certainly from a shipper's perspective, I see both of that. The laws, it's heavily regulated, transportation laws heavily regulated, and it's heavily papered. So the contracting side is where I see most of the work, and really it's the balance that you do with the risk model that sort of happens even as you go from different modes of transportation. And as I've noted, Dell uses them all, right? So for each mode of transportation, you have a different risk model that you have to view. There's also an importance in understanding the product, the value of whatever the cargo is. And standard fare for a lot of the regulations won't quite get us to the right value if we suffer a loss. So a lot of negotiation, of course, goes into making sure that we have adequate protections in the event of loss and damage caused by our carriers. There's also freight forwarders and, you know, the liability limits that might exist there. So we always have a lot of conversation about who's doing what and who's going to bear the brunt of what happens in the event of a loss. And that, of course, is where the, you know, where the gritty details have to go into how products are being ushered from one mode of transportation to another to final mile. And that's a whole other area that we could certainly talk about in terms of final mile delivery, getting the you know, customer end user the products that they've requested. And so again, if you think about each tranche of how shipments are transported, that has its own level of papering that needs to be done from a contracting standpoint.
Right. And then Britton, you probably come from more of the business side of or business perspective. And usually the business people I talk to say, well, the lawyers fit in at the place where they seem to create a lot of friction. And so people are sort of, the challenge is sometimes, you know, how can lawyers work more smoothly, quicker, those sorts of things. And we'll address that a little bit. But sort of, how do you see lawyers fitting into the supply chain now?
Well, in all honesty, I've had to rely on lawyers, you know, quite frequently in a lot of the work that I do, especially when I was a consultant for Deloitte and Capgemini. And the way that they helped for what I was doing with the supply chain was really ensuring that both parties, all of the parties, I should say, we were contracting or that we were signing agreements with, that they were ethical in what they were doing and that it was legal in what we were doing. So for example, Nestle's a former client of mine. And one of the things that we had to ensure on the part of Nestle was that we're were all of the activities taking place in Africa, for example, was it ethical? Were they using child labor? Were children being abused? Were villages being taken advantage of? And we had to do a lot of extensive analysis, leveraging attorneys who would go over and evaluate and legally document for us that all of the regulations that were international and domestic and so forth were being followed. And once we had that, then we knew for a fact that things we were going to put in place related to the supply chain were going to be approved, but that it was something we could honestly feel good about. And it was something that when it became audited, we knew it would pass. Because especially in a lot of the work I do overseas, especially in the Middle East and that, they're frequently audited. And you have to ensure that the attorneys have signed off that things are ethical, things are legal in what we are doing. So I always relied on attorneys. I've always appreciated their efforts. I've never once looked at it and said, the attorneys are causing friction. I always looked at it as the attorneys are there to make sure that we're not putting maybe a dollar amount over the things that are ethical and the things that are legal. And that's something that a lot of people have a tendency to do, even in a consulting game, the consulting industry. And so I appreciated that about the attorneys who would say, look, we have a problem here. And yes, it may slow down some of the things we were doing, but at the end of the day, it was important that we did those things so we could always say we were operating from a perspective of ethics. And that's, from my perspective, that's how I work with attorneys the most.
Right. So Michael, let me ask you about, one thing that's striking about the supply chain is its complexity. So what are some of the most challenging, I would say, new legal issues that you're seeing? Not necessarily things that keep you awake at night, but sort of what do you see that are sort of the big issues out there right now?
Yeah, if I can just follow up with Britton just for a second about what he was mentioning and talk about ethics. One of the coolest things that I ever got to do as an attorney was working for Ford Motor Company, and they went an ethical supply chain. It was for battery sourcing. So we were looking to use a company at IBM to do a blockchain process to responsibly source cobalt in the Congo. So as an attorney, this was one of these where people looked around and went, hey, do you have some time? And I was like, yeah, let me, I knew almost nothing about blockchain and literally zero about cobalt, other than it goes in the battery before I started. But the point of me being there, to Britton's point, was to make sure that we were trying to create an ethical supply chain, right? And they wanted they needed legal support there to understand, in my case, the technology, the law, right, international shipping, and how cobalt was produced, and how we could actually say, maybe at some point, 50% of a battery that is produced in your vehicle was ethically sourced, and we're on our way to 100. So a great example, him tying in with what you were just talking about, Britton, that it was a unique experience in my career, but it was one I had, and I'm sure there's obviously many, many other people who do that much more frequently. But if you open yourself up to the possibilities and you are interested in supply chain, sometimes these opportunities will come to you. In my case, I kind of out of left field. So just want to tie that in, because I'm glad to hear that that type of participation is appreciated. And you said, especially in the consulting industry, right? That's a tough balance between maximizing dollars and minimizing risk. And to have somebody to look at you as an ethical source is pretty, it makes you feel good as a person, makes you feel you're doing the right thing. And ethical sourcing in like battery production is obviously going to get bigger, not smaller, as battery chemistry changes and we move maybe towards solid state. So just wanted to mention that real quick. So in my world, the things that are going to be large issues for me, and they're not necessarily directly supply chain related, but they will be. As I think, Lauren, you mentioned, Congress, right? I'm working now with a company, May Mobility, on autonomous driving, right? Level 5, fully autonomous, no wheel, hands-off driving. As you can probably imagine, you see in the news sometimes, where communities, it's been piecemeal. Communities, some embrace, some are less excited about testing on their city streets and things. And as laws start to come out, right to repair laws, other things that we'll have where we've got combinations of OEM vehicles and our technology on top of them. There's going to be a number of legal issues there for us to deal with. And when Congress steps in and writes a law, it's probably going to be less than optimal. I think I feel pretty comfortable saying that to what the industry actually is doing and wants to do. So there's going to be all kinds of issues there. And at some point, right, it's going to tie into the supply chain. We're going to have issues where the Congress says you must do X, and to do X, I'm going to have to go find a supplier, whether it's a human being, a company, a piece part, whatever it might be, to solve that problem. And I guess in my world, in the main mobility world right now, it's the law, and the fallout will be the supply chain for us. I think it'll be, what do we have to do to comply with these rules? And at some point, because we're working with physical things, vehicles, we're going to have to engage our supply chain, make sure we have parts in the right place, make sure we have the ability to give them and send them back to manufacturers or pull data off of them for law enforcement or other reasons. And right now, you know, vehicles will do that. For example, in an accident, there's all kinds of telemetrics and data that you get from a vehicle. What happens when there's cameras on them, right? And what if so there's a number of things that I'm not sure of. And that's why I'm excited to be doing what I'm doing, because as it starts to coalesce and we start to get some standards, I think there's just so much opportunity to work in this area, and you're not behind, you're ahead, you're moving with the technology, with the needs of the supply chain, and you're right there kind of in the middle of it. So that's what's exciting about my position. And I think the fallout for me is going to be a little bit later, where it really starts to affect the supply chain as we get more regulated.
Hey, Michael, for perspective, I recall being at Volkswagen, and the repair community was challenging the ability to repair key fobs. And so, and that evolution now, of course, is about the entire vehicle itself. If you're talking about a fully automated vehicle, so what an evolution that is, to just have something as simple as a key fob and fighting for the right to repair that versus the right to repair a fully autonomous vehicle. Very fascinating.
That's a great perspective, great context.
Yeah. So Lauren, what's happening on the water that you think is big these days?
I mean, you may have heard the president mention it recently. There's some congestion out there. The first time in a very, very, very maybe ever long time that the president has mentioned supply chain, and specifically ocean. I think the biggest thing, a little bit building from that, is misunderstanding of the market, misunderstanding of ocean shipping. So billions of dollars in the ocean shipping world, these profits are unusual. Nobody expected this. Yeah, maybe you might have thought they're going to make some money, but nobody expected them to be on par with tech companies. Because prior to this, and for everyone who's kind of newer to ocean understanding, they were lucky to break even. I remember when I was first at the Federal Maritime Commission, and I learned that ocean carriers, they supply 90% of the world's everything. I mean, everything. Eat, use, all of our like everything. Arguably, trucking is 100%. I've actually heard the quote, it's 100% except for the baby that you the birth at the hospital. Arguably, that is even included in the 100% of everything. But no, so going back to the billions of dollars, it was unusual for ocean shippers to even break even or have any sort of profit for a very, very long time. And so misunderstanding that, and trying to kind of assign blame these days and saying because they're making so much money, they must be doing something wrong. Maybe they are, but it's certainly not to the billions of dollars world. That they've been said to be in cartels. They're really not cartels. They are vessel sharing arrangements. Matt, when he introduced us, was talking about there's actually 7 major players of the ocean carrier world, and they're into 3 different alliances. And what these alliances are vessel sharing and kind of equipment sharing. They're not rate setting. They cannot go anywhere near setting these rates, but they can, because when everybody was not making much money, and they had more capacity than what people needed. There was too much space on some of these vessels. Imagine that just 10 years ago, too much space on some of these vessels. Instead of basically going under because they couldn't float their own their own P&Ls, they kind of joined together to help create more capacity for the industry so that you can actually ship on more vessels to more locations. And so it was kind of seen as a good thing at the time. And so now it's being said to be cartel-like. It's not necessarily. There's 3 alliances, and that they roughly make up about 20 to 30% of each alliance of the global market. And so having that limited market share is something that is important to watch. And so that's what the Federal Maritime Commission is doing, is watching that. But it's important for that to be kind of understood. A few other major issues that are coming this year specifically is there's a labor negotiation that's going to be happening on the West Coast. The ILWU is now going to be negotiating with basically the ocean carriers. That's going to start in May, and the contract itself is completed in June 30th. It expires June 30th, July 1st. So hopefully everything goes well. I mean, I think everybody's like, hopefully it goes well and there's no interruptions. But it would be prudent for everybody to kind of start, and you're seeing that in the industry right now, is that maybe some of the ocean carriers are starting to go to diversifying their ports of entry. So where LA Long Beach has notoriously been the only large port on the West Coast that is taking the majority of all of our ocean shipments, now it's starting to be a little bit more diversified, because the ocean freight rate is so expensive that if you're, prior to, you could have a lower freight rate going in and out of LA Long Beach. And now you still have those high rates, but you're losing the control. You might as well go gain some control at some of these other ports, these smaller ports. And, if you're going to be paying the same amount. And so, I think that we're going to see a little bit more of that. Things that we didn't expect that are having effects, war in Ukraine, what else is going to be happening? Maybe COVID comes back, Shanghai, it's hitting Shanghai really strongly right now. That we will see a reverberation effect from that, because basically the ports of Shanghai are shut down. So there's going to be some rerouting, there's some vessel congestion happening there. I think I like to say that 2020 was the problems happening. 2021 was identifying the problems, and 2022, I was hopeful that it was going to be starting to move past some of our problems, knowing that COVID wasn't going to be totally out of the woods yet. I think 2023 is going to be a little bit more, I think the war might have bumped that. I think the labor contract was always going to be in 2022. So I think those are some of the biggest issues that I'm kind of watching and reporting on as I see.
And then Evelyn?
Well, there's a lot of things to unpack with just what Lauren described. And maybe I'll start with the ocean space and what Dell has done, for example, and what other shippers have had to do in light of the port congestion, the backlog, and how, as a company, we've had to strategize and pivot to make sure that we still deliver products in the way that our customers really have become accustomed to. So I think it's an interesting dynamic in terms of that space. But then there's so many countless other things that I certainly could respond to with regard to what's going on right now with Russia, and our need to not just respond and react, but we'll also partner with trying to make sure that we are responding appropriately, responding to sanctions. And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the humanitarian efforts that as an organization, we have certainly stood up to do that. And so again, so many things that you could just unpack with everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do want to talk a little bit about what we'll call the current evolving situation. And so we had COVID, the major COVID supply chain disruptions. Now we have war disruptions. I've read that we're within a few days of the Shanghai lockdown causing just major disruptions. We've had the lines of container ships off the ports. We've seen, cargo containers of luxury cars burn up because nobody can kind of get to them. And so I think that to me, it's kind of interesting when you look at that, and you look at the role of lawyer, that it's so complex, and you look at any of these issues that come up, they have lots of legal complications. Like the whole idea that yesterday we can say, we're just going to slap a bunch of more sanctions on Russia, which looks like nobody can do business in any way with Russia. That has enormous consequences for somebody who's a lawyer looking at the supply chain. And then if we have all the container ships stacked up, then you as a lawyer can't really say, I'm going to go to court and make this big ship move, because it's not going to happen. You can't jump them to the head of the line. So I guess as you look at some of these very complex issues that are starting to happen that are driven by events, how do you start to address some of those issues? And I know you probably can't go into specific details, but are there some things where you've said, here was an issue, there's a legal ramification, and we were able to do a workaround that really helps, that probably nobody else noticed? So I guess, Michael, let's sort of start with you again, and just say, looking at everything that's going on, what are the new types of legal work and the sort of legal successes that maybe you can bring, that you bring as a lawyer into the supply chain?
I think the thing that jumps out at me is, from a technology standpoint, is that your relative buying power, your purchasing power, your place in an industry, right, dictates a lot of what you can do, not from a legal perspective, the law is the law, but what kind of attention you'll get from vendors. And when we're trying to, so in what Rivian had done, for example, they did what a traditional OEM would do, and they split the legal procurement group into two. There's direct and indirect procurement. And that model, I think, used to work really well, but it doesn't work very well now because of the crossover of technology in vehicles, right? So one of the things that I think we learned, or I've learned, is that when I was working on ECUs, right, electronic control units and telematics control units and things, and then supply chain, right, we've talked about chip shortages, securing agreements with our vendors for any chips or anything was difficult, right? There wasn't a lot of things we could do from a legal perspective when Samsung or a major producer would say, we don't have it, or what we didn't have was transparency. And I think this is where I helped, and others in my field and other places helped, was I got some transparency. I went through my legal counsel on the other side and said, hey, I don't know where you are in your supply chain, when these chips will be available. I know you probably can't tell me. There's nothing in the contract that we signed that talked about any kind of notice provision, delay in shipment. There was maybe financial repercussions for delay, right? But not like any kind of notice of, hey, your chips are 13 days away from being delivered. Maybe some of the OEMs that had that and thought ahead, we hadn't. So I think in that sense, where we could get some wins, we're getting some transparency to the supply chain. Couldn't change what we had signed. Didn't have a lot of purchasing power necessarily at the time, but I think where the legal team, where I helped and others, was getting that kind of transparency. And fortunately, we worked with some very good suppliers, most of which were willing to give us that information as much as they could, right, without divulging anything that was proprietary or confidential about their business. But that was really where we made some headway, and especially as a new manufacturer, it was difficult to. It was difficult for us to anticipate our production volumes. And if you followed Rivian at all, you see there, production hell. I would say it's nowhere near as bad as Tesla was when they started from a quality perspective. But that's where we could help. We had the plant, we had people, we're trained, the thing is ready to run. We don't have the parts, right? When will we have them? And it was important to us, we could spend more time training people in the plant, right? If we knew we had that kind of flexibility as we're hiring. So when I got to help get that transparency for certain things, it helped all the way down the line, literally to the time that they thought they could spend training people in a new factory with new equipment. So it wasn't the law that I was using to our advantage. It was relationships and building those through my procurement folks in the supply chain, which then had downstream business effects that I never really been thought about until it started to happen, frankly. So that's kind of my story there.
That's great. How about you, Lauren?
Yeah, so I mean, so I would say digitization. So new types of legal work and legal successes. I would say digitization is going to be the hot new topic that we should all be following. And so how does law work into that? There's some obvious ways, but one of the biggest ways is standardizing the lingo. There's a big push, in DC especially, there's a few groups, but internationally, because that's where it's going to be most important because we're all connected by the ocean, is standardizing that lingo. Because as you get further into the supply chain generally and kind of have that awareness of also ocean, surface transport has different lingo or different meanings to the same lingo as ocean transport. So detention and demurrage are big issues right now. The Federal Maritime Commission is doing a big regulatory rulemaking on them. But detention and demurrage take on different meanings and maybe are called different things on the surface side of things as they are on the ocean side. Might be per diem charges. And so what it really comes down to, for those who don't really know, so detention and demurrage is basically detention, the use of the box. Demurrage is kind of the use of the space, so on the yard or wherever. And so and that's the ocean, the short version of the ocean explanation of that. So it's trying to figure out how to, if we are going to be digitizing the cargo movement and watching where the boxes go, it's protecting the IP, the business intelligence, but then it's also making it so that it's formulated in a way that not only is everyone speaking the same language, but that it's being equally accessed and it really kind of links everybody together without, there's some very real concerns about job creation or job elimination because of digitization, kind of harkening back to the labor discussion that's going to be happening next month. Digitization is a big part of that. One understanding if that is part of the fear of the autonomy, or if speeding everything up, the autonomy is going to actually help everybody. And so, instead of data input, it's going to be QAing the data. And so, who doesn't like to do that? I mean, that's going to be better than inputting all those container numbers and letters and all that. So I would say digitization and kind of helping to create and craft the law, but then also translate and apply the law to that issue.
Right. Evelyn?
Hey, so for the last 2 years, starting right before the pandemic and throughout, there's been a concept that I did not think I would spend as much time on, and that is force majeure. Learned about it in law school, got packed away, of course, and it emerged on a number of fronts. First with a major tornado that happened in the Tennessee area that leveled at least 2 of our buildings. And thankfully, there were very few injuries. So I can talk more about, of course, what happened with that. So we have fulfillment centers in that area where we have, there's a number of things happening in the warehouse beyond just the movement of goods. It's also what we call second touch, where, if you have a Dell laptop and we have a lot of corporations that will want their laptops configured, those types of things are happening. So there was this, we had to sort of parse through who owned what at the point that the tornado hit to kind of get to the insurability of those goods. So that was like, wow, that was interesting. Then COVID hit, right? And so now you have force majeure in the form of us getting blanket force majeure notices, although it's from a contracting standpoint, you have to give notice in a particular way under the contract. But force majeure notices were flying off of the shelves to us from various providers. And at the same time, many of the U.S. government and other governments similarly were saying that the supply chain was an exception in terms of, everything that halted and needed to stop during COVID. Well, of course, the transport of goods is considered essential, particularly as you think about, very sensitive goods or medical supplies and things of that nature. So we sort of had to address, is it force majeure? Are you not able to perform? And also, are you listening to what the government's saying, which is what you can perform? So it was just kind of an analysis of whether or not those force majeure claims were legitimate or not, and how do you address it? And were they really just an opportunity to say, we need to charge you more money to do business? So they were sort of hiding behind that, quite frankly. And then if that wasn't enough, back to Tennessee, where there was massive 100-year flooding, where our products were subject to, again, very catastrophic. And again, force majeure was right into the picture, where we had products floating down a creek right next to a fulfillment center. So again, force majeure came up once again. And then, as you might imagine, with the Russian conflict, that it could bear its discussions are sort of coming to bear once again. So while I thought that was going to be something that I wouldn't have to talk about a whole lot, it turns out that we have to talk about it quite a bit, given the current events that have transpired over the past 2 years.
Then, Britton, I'm really interested in your perspectives on some of these things. What are the really big challenges we're facing in recent times, in the last 2 years, and as you look to see what's coming in the near future, legal or otherwise?
Well, certainly the disruption of the supply chain globally, that's been a big challenge for many of the companies. I support certainly the issues with COVID that had a major impact. But I really have to say the more interesting thing that I've been confronted with, and that I believe is going to be a challenge for a lot of companies, and I think is really an interesting problem for the legal industry as it relates to the supply chain, is the metaverse. And what I find so interesting is how many companies reach out to me, number one, to have me help them explain what the metaverse is, how can they be a part of it. But as we're talking about the supply chain in the metaverse, and for clarification, there's a false belief that in the metaverse, products will be sold that will only be used by individuals in the metaverse. And that's false. I'm working with multiple companies, multiple retailers, and the way we view the metaverse is that it's the removal of websites. And it's a new way to engage with customers. And so my retail clients and that, they're going to be selling actual products in the metaverse through a metaverse store. And then, of course, we have to have a corresponding supply chain where people who buy those products in the metaverse can have those products delivered. But one of the things that I found so interesting are the legal questions that come up. Because who owns the product in the metaverse? Who has liability in the metaverse? And so one of the things that's been fascinating is listening to lawyers as they come up with ways to try and apply law for something that really doesn't exist yet. And it's apply law to a world that's supposed to be separate from the world in which we live. And so I'm really watching this closely to see how does this all work itself out. We know what legal ramifications are there, what supply chain ramifications are there. And so that's really been one of the more interesting things that I've been focused on. But are we going to continue to see challenges in the supply chain disruptions? Of course. My opinion on this is a little different. When the supply chain began to be disrupted, my response was, so what? Big deal. Supply chains aren't supposed to be static enterprises that are never disrupted. And we've had periods throughout history where major disruptions occur. And so I've never looked at the things going on in the supply chain globally as things to be feared about, to be feared or necessarily to be concerned about. Instead, you have to confront them each on their own. And you come up with a way to solve them, or as we used to say in the Marines, you improvise, you adapt, you overcome, you go over, under, or through the obstacles, but you get it done. And that's just what is then it's just the things that I've been focused on. And that's the attitude I've been really sharing with my clients. That's so what if the supply chain is disrupted? So what if containers are waiting or ships are waiting? Who cares? Come up with a solution. Stop complaining about it. Stop thinking you're going to, that you can actually influence it, and just fix it. And that's led to really interesting discussions again with the legal team when we say we want to try and do something completely different. We want to go outside contracts. And again, there's that desire to just want to go do it. But the thing that I'm so grateful for is that I've worked with so many attorneys over the years who always told me, no matter what, Britton, don't pull the trigger. Don't just pull the trigger and go do something. Make sure you involve the legal team in this. Make sure someone from legal is involved in this so that they make sure your gung-ho attitude doesn't get you in trouble. And I really have taken that to heart. So although I'm super motivated, I still rely on the legal teams of these companies I support, that I'm a consultant for, to make sure that although we're going to be going outside the norm of the supply chain, we're doing it the right way, and we're not going to cause ourselves more trouble.
Yeah, that's great. I sort of feel like the metaverse in the supply chain could be our next program, man. So it's really interesting. So I know we have questions here.
We'll go ahead and have Matt actually ask the questions.
Come over and sit with me.
All right. And I have a couple more, but I'll save them for later.
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. How are you? Here's my first question. I want to kind of dive into. General average. What does this mean, Lauren? What does this mean? What should we know about this?
So it's a maritime insurance principle. So it's kind of actually, there was a really great example the other day given by Lars Jensen. So this is probably the best way to understand it, not being within the ocean world. But imagine you're riding on a bus. And so everybody's on a bus, you paid a ticket to get on the bus. The bus breaks down, the driver gets a little hurt, and the bus has to be towed. So what happens is everybody that's on that bus now has to pay into the kind of, we got to fix this bus problem because we're all riding on the bus. And so that's what the general average fund is all those riders, all those cargo owners are paying into this general fund. And so you might be fine. You might be able to get your cargo. You might be able to hop off that bus and no problem. You don't need any money out of the fund. But the fund is also paying for the bus because your little ticket is not actually going to cover the entire bus. And so that's part of what it is now bringing it out of the example. Shipping is a very expensive thing. And so, like I said, for a very long time, there weren't billions of dollars being made here. And so if something happened to that ship and it started getting really expensive, so we're seeing the ever forward, or how it's more appropriately being called the never forward right now because it's stuck. But what's happening is they're trying to refloat it. And so they've tried 3 or 4 different times to dredge it, they're going to start taking cargo off. They're going to start taking fuel off. They're doing all these things. These are expensive things to do to this already very expensive vessel. And so what could happen if they weren't making billions of dollars is this could drive Evergreen to bankruptcy. And all of a sudden you're going to drop out an entire ocean carrier out of the system because they couldn't afford to refloat this vessel. And so that's kind of what general average is for, is so that everybody that was on that ship can help kind of pay for it. And then if there's money left over and you lose some cargo, you get reimbursed for that cargo loss as well.
So if you have items on a ship that needs to get off and you have to advance for this general average, can you go back and say to the carrier later on, or the shipping company, it's your fault that had this happen? Like, I'll help you get it off now, but I want to get indemnification. Does that happen? Or is it once you pay into this, you're done?
So there's marine insurance that can kind of help here. So it doesn't have to be out of your pocket. And so that's the benefit of having this cargo insurance. So that if there is general average, or if there's piracy, or if there's all these things that like, oh, that'll never happen. And as we know, it happens. This is something that helps kind of protect the cargo owner from. And Evelyn, I think you've probably had some experience here. Matt, you had asked the question that there might have been an Ever Given situation.
Yeah, tell me about this, Evelyn.
General average was also declared in the Ever Given, which was the Suez Canal.
Yeah, we had to fix that bus.
So you had to help pay to get your stuff taken care of in that Ever Given situation.
Yeah, it was interesting as I was reading the stories and really the last year, and we've been talking about just how interesting supply chain has been, and it's become the center of things. So I look at the paper every day, and there's something about, the Suez Canal and the Ever Given ship vessel being lodged, and really just stopping a whole bunch of other vessels from moving through. And I was like, that's interesting, until I got onto my computer and started and logged on. And then next thing you know, I see Ever Given in the subject line. I'm like, no, it can't be, because, we're out there, of course, and I don't know what vessels we're on at any given moment. So it could have been that we had nothing to do with it. But turns out we had a few containers on the ship. And my team and that I shared with you is in Bratislava, and I have a person who is focused on ocean. We were scrambling because it doesn't come up a lot. As Lauren sort of breathes it every day, it comes up every once in a while for us. And it was sort of a combination of, yes, we do have marine insurance, and we finally understood what the general average was, what meant for us. But it was also just, again, when you talk about the insurability of goods, you got to look at where it is in the supply chain. We have things that are part of our supplier chain, that's owned by our supplier. We haven't taken ownership yet. And so we talk about the risk transference, who bore the risk at the point in which the loss, or it wasn't even a loss really, because nothing, I don't think anything was damaged. It was just delayed, right? So, but we had to get validation and get that to our insurers, because of course they're not going to pitch in for anything that we don't own, right? So it was kind of confirmation of, our operations team, what was on there, what got, deployed. It was our inventory. Do we show this on our books? And then it was, of course, legally, we were also interfacing with our providers that also had containers on there, just to make sure that we knew who owned what at that given time. So it was just a fascinating thing, because I learned, of course, that this maritime law has been around since it was the Digest of Justinian from 800 BC. Are you kidding me? And I'm like, we're still talking about.
This is what I love about maritime law. I understood, I thought it was just basically pirate law, and that was the extent of it. But Lauren has educated me. It's so much more beyond. Now, this is a question for both Britton and Michael to kind of think about. I'll let you guys answer it however you want. But the challenge we have in supply chain generally is a shortage of drivers. I mean, this is the challenge we talk about. There's not enough drivers. The real piece, I think, is more that the job of driving isn't what it used to be. And so the delivery of bringing goods has been moving from the idea of going to a retail store to having them delivered to you. Amazon kind of was the biggest pusher in this. And Britton, your work with micro fulfillment is really about bringing things quicker to people. And I believe with May Mobility and what you've done at Rivian, part of this desire is autonomous vehicles that can get things to customers without having a human being interacting. So when you guys are looking at these things, what are the biggest supply chain hurdles that need to be overcome? And what is it that a vehicle manufacturer like May needs to understand about a micro fulfillment company that wants to probably use that asset at some point?
Well, from my perspective, and the thing that I'm spending a lot of time on, I'm actually working with a lot of different companies that are in the autonomous space, primarily in Europe, a few in the US. And it's really working with them to understand that as they are able to perfect the use of autonomous vehicles, and regulations are passed allowing them to be used in cities and states and so forth, that really it does make sense for them to have an understanding of the value of a micro fulfillment center being served directly by an autonomous vehicle, and that autonomous vehicle taking product from that micro fulfillment center and making the delivery. And so what we're doing, the clients I'm working with, we're working with autonomous vehicle companies, logistics companies, and we're basically already putting together that operating model. How do we communicate? How do we ensure that we have complete understanding of what each of us are supposed to do? What's our requirement for success? Things like that. But I agree with you that the big challenge and the big benefit is that as autonomous vehicles are approved and they really become part of the normal supply chain, the everyday supply chain, the amount of value that's going to drive is just extensive. It's just out of this world. And so when I design strategies for companies related to micro fulfillment, I basically have to write strategies based on the reality of today. And then I basically also have a strategy that now, as autonomous vehicles become part of the supply chain, part of our logistics capabilities, this is now the impact that they will have.
What do you think, Michael?
I think you're spot on, Britton. I think one of the things, the supply chain problem we have, we had at Rivian, we have at May and others, are people, engineers. The fight for talent, right? To get them in the doors and keep them and not be poached by the bigger companies is problem like 1A. And that's not traditional supply chain, right? But it is, we cycle through people, they get the experience and they move on. But the one thing that I've seen this, and I don't want to call out the company, but last mile delivery, right? So Amazon was our biggest, Rivian's biggest investor. They still are. And there's a relationship between the CEO at Rivian and Jeff Bezos. They spend a lot of time talking about last mile delivery, right? And some of those discussions, the outcomes of those we were privy to, and their thoughts on these things. And there was a company who suggested that they wanted people to, actual human beings, to do the last mile, and they called it pedestrian portering, which was basically people walking, carrying boxes. It was not the best of ideas, but people are throwing things against the wall. Amazon obviously is a leader in this space, right? And the leader in delivery. And Amazon is a technology company who moves, obviously, things better than anyone else has in the history of the world. When we start talking about our vehicles or vehicles being used to do last mile delivery, I think you're going to find that there's, the ultimate idea, I think, is that someday my vehicle can go deliver packages, right? I don't own the vehicle. There's a kind of a rental model, an on-demand service for vehicles. You don't have a vehicle that sits 92% of its time is sitting in your driveway. But from a supply chain perspective, this is hard to LiDAR cameras, deciding whether the industry goes as Elon Musk wants to go is pretty insistent that cameras eventually will be able to, or can now to a great degree, propel this last mile delivery by reducing cost, using cameras. Others want to use LiDAR and cameras. I think you're going to have companies that'll produce just small delivery vehicles, right? That are maybe small, much smaller than a cube truck. May is into proving our technology, but the technology moving people could easily move goods. And I think the ultimate part of this eventually someday is what they call CV to X, where the vehicle is connected to everything. So when Britton was talking about, what's the next generation, whether May produces the software and somebody produces the vehicle, I think it's that CV to X thing that is where the vehicle know as it's driving, there's a parking spot in front of the floor. It's there for them. There'll be the pace of movement can be so much more fluid because of the interoperability and interactivity of all these different modes of transportation, a multimodal model, right? And I think there's a place for that last mile delivery to really, upend the world. Truck driving, as you said, you started off saying it's not a glamorous job anymore. May Mobility is working to produce a vehicle that's self-driving. That doesn't mean you take that software and stick it on a truck for obvious reasons: size, weight, mass, turning, all the things that go into driving a truck that aren't driving a car. So while you've seen some companies talk about, some of them, I'll put it this way, we're less than honest about their capabilities with trucks.
Generous of you, very generous of you.
Rolling them downhill, for example. I think
Nicola, excuse me, sorry.
Eventually the industry will get there, but I think it just demonstrates we're a long way from there. You don't hear Tesla. Tesla's modeling trucks, others are modeling trucks, but you don't see anywhere near the advance of a semi-sized truck being autonomous. So that gap is going to need to be filled, and it's going to be filled by, I think, sooner than later, delivery trucks, the last mile trucks, so you don't have the UPS truck going down the street with a driver in it anymore. It'll be a truck, autonomous vehicle.
Well, so autonomous vehicle hits a pedestrian. Is this a negligence case? Is this a products liability case? And I need a definitive legal answer right now.
Which side of the argument?
What do you think? How do you think about that problem, Michael?
Which side of the argument am I on?
That's right.
My lawyer.
That's why lawyers are so important. We got to know both sides. Yeah, you have to know both sides. But that's a really interesting question. There's design decisions have to be made. what does the robot protect? Is it the driver? Is it the pedestrians? These are decisions that are not, you can't opt out of those.
So let me back up from a legal perspective one step before that. And it's something we're working on right now. And I know Argo and others are, right? So if we take our autonomous driving kit and put it onto a Toyota vehicle, for example, Toyota is our biggest investor, and those are the vehicles we're running right now, all over the country, but not, not in a commercial sense. That like we're working through communities and cities and townships right now, but eventually when they're on the road, when there's an accident, right? And the data that comes off the vehicle, who and how do you determine whether it was a fault of the ADK, it was a fault of the vehicle for not, there's a mechanical or software issue that's generous or is vehicle centric, like that Toyota made? Where does the line go between, well, that system lets off, stops and ours picks up? What if there's a physical problem with the vehicle and they don't have, their brakes are worn, or one of the brake pads doesn't grab? How do you start to unravel that? And on top of it, the accident, right? What it hit, the liability there, who it might have hit, potentially, and start to peel all that apart. So one of the things we're doing now is working with, and I don't know the answer, is working with our insurance carrier, like the biggest insurance carrier in the country. And they're doing the same thing. They're thinking, we insure some Argo now, we insure these companies now, but their model currently isn't the future model. And the future model is coming. How do we insure it? And they don't know either. I mean, we're all working together and having these discussions from a legal liability, products liability, all NHTSA's involved, right, for vehicles. How does this all come together? And it's far beyond my capability to imagine how it's going to end. But I do know these conversations are happening every day all over the country because no one quite knows yet. And the vehicle, that's the classic example you gave, is the vehicle, the edge of a cliff, if they go right, a baby and her mother, if they, go left. In that case, I'm for going right and going off the cliff. I'm not running over a child and their mother. But regardless, that's the dilemma, right? At some point, what does the vehicle do? And one of the things that's different about May, and I'll leave it at this, is they use something called multi-policy decision making. So your Argos and your Uber and Waymos of the world are driving around millions and millions and millions and millions of miles, and they're generating all that data, capturing all that data, applying algorithms to that data, doing all kinds of thousands and millions of calculations about possibilities, right? And I've seen this before. I've seen a bike, I've seen a small dog. May Mobility does a little different. It's more of a predictive analysis where our car comes to a corner and says, there's so many things that could happen here. We see we survey the field and say, it's highly unlikely that person's going to ride their bike across the street in a red light. It might happen, but we think we can proceed slowly and keep an eye on the person on the corner. Not that we've seen that before necessarily. I mean, it's a pretty simple example, but the car will make some predictive analysis about how it can drive safely, even if there is risk. So as this all develops, when you think about like last mile delivery and a vehicle going down the street, that's the kind of, I think at least, the kind of technology and algorithms and logic you need to apply to autonomous driving, because there's kids in the street and dogs run out and things that you're not, the Waymos and others of the world, they'll get there, they're more concerned with cities and getting people from robo-taxi, right? But to Britton's point, when you're having vehicles go down the street, that last mile delivery, they're going to need to think maybe a little bit differently, the vehicle itself a little bit differently about its environment. And those are just some of the branches that are happening in, in the industry to get us to the point where we do have true last mile delivery. It's not ubiquitous, it won't be ubiquitous for a while, but start to really move where there's communities that have it across the country.
It's absolutely fast. I have one last question I want to ask, and I'll turn it over to Grace to has some great questions for all of you as well. So I'm going to start with you, Lauren. We know that there is this incredible human catastrophe in Ukraine. We know Russian aggression has brought untold suffering to millions of people. And one of the things that's happened with the shipping companies specifically, and these alliances you kind of touched on earlier, is that some of these alliances are saying, okay, we're done. We're not going to do business here anymore. Now, part of that was the result of Vladimir Putin saying, I'm going to start seizing assets, and that might have been kind of forced. But what have you seen so far in your practice and your advice that you're talking to clients about, not just Ukraine specifically, but what do you do when things go crazy like this? What is your thoughts on this currently?
Well, so, I don't want to go too far into the Russia-Ukraine stuff, just because, it's still kind of it's a very fluid thing. So, obviously the oil is moving by pipeline, but it's also moving by ship. And so as oil is still being purchased from Russia, it still needs to be moving by ship. But taking it a little bit out of that. So you kind of asked, so like when things go wrong, what do you do? I'd like to piggyback a little bit off of what Britton was saying earlier, where just fix it. And I think diversifying the ports of entry are a huge thing that's happening. I mean, we have these enormous ships that are out there sailing the world, and there's only, a handful of ports that can service those enormous ships out there sailing the world. So now I think we're going to start seeing maybe a move towards some of these mid-sized ships so that they can go to ports that have really no congestion. I mean, as much as we're hearing about congestion out there, there are quite a few ports that have zero congestion. And so, if there's a problem, just fix it. So if you can't get your goods because you're stuck, why don't you move to a port that you won't get stuck at? There's lots of different ways that you can get your goods from that port into the internal system. And then actually going back to the Ukraine, Russia, I think having some protection over the mariners. The mariners are the forgotten, most important employee in the world, I would arguably say, because they're the ones that are actually moving all this 90% of everything everywhere. And so they were the last ones to really be thought of for getting vaccines during COVID, because if it's a two-part system for a vaccine and a mariner's only really ever anywhere for a couple hours, maybe 24 hours, even when they go home, they're not going to be there that long. They might not be there long enough to come back 3 weeks later to go get the second shot. So making sure that the mariners are taken care of, and all the waterways around this conflict. I mean, we've all seen it in the news that some of these vessels are just civilian vessels are getting hit and they're sinking. I mean, and that's the only thing that any of those mariners were doing was just their job. They were just trying to help the world get their goods. Some of it's a little humanitarian, and they're trying to bring in humanitarian aid by vessel. And so, I think getting back to a little bit of a lighter note, I think it really is, I'd say moreover than anything is identifying that mariners. It's a little hard to have a national perspective on this, because mariners, they do have a nation state, but they're also kind of citizens of the world, and so they're moving around, they're all over the place. And, obviously they do hold their passport, but we need to, as like a world, take better care of the mariners. When the US went on lockdown and the essential personnel were identified, port workers were left off that list. You can't even get PPE if you can't bring it in a port, so then, they fixed it. It took maybe 6 months to fix it, but it was like, of course, mariners are important. Of course, longshoremen, of course, port workers are important. Yeah, of course they're important. Like, you can't move things inside the country without it. So, I think that's going to be, luckily that's been corrected. But silver linings that come from bad stuff, just like Britton was saying, just fix it, and keep legal close by, because maybe that wouldn't have been overlooked. Maybe they would have, if you had me around, I'd say port workers are important, guys.
Evelyn, how has it impacted your business? How is that? How are these sanctions, and how is this event currently unfolding for you guys?
Yeah, well, as I've noted, and we have some public statements out there about how we've responded. There was a Wall Street Journal article, I think in the latter part of March, that kind of covers what we've had to do. I wanted to focus one thing though, on the shipper's perspective with regard to final mile delivery, which I think is the vulnerabilities that sort of exist in that space are more prevalent today than they've ever been. I've been in the supply chain industry now for at least a decade. And of course, data privacy and cybersecurity have never, were not the forefront of my focus, but it is now in terms of the personal information that we transport or we transfer with our customers to a lot of providers. And, we don't have to necessarily worry about data protection per se with the larger providers that we've partnered with for years. But we certainly, when we think about how the transport goes from that large provider to a smaller mom and pop single truck owner, for example, and them just not having the capacity to deal with the brunt of a data security breach is a bit problematic in terms of the exposure that we have as a sophisticated organization, that it is paramount that we maintain the security of our, not just of our data, but obviously with regard to, just personal information that might be hanging out there. And I think the final mile delivery sort of ushered that in a way that we just didn't anticipate. Like I said, 15 years ago and 10 years ago, and certainly before then. I'm wondering what
is that a problem you're thinking about, Michael, when it comes to the data information about what the shippers are concerned with?
Oh, absolutely. So from a Rivian standpoint, and this is true for Ford and others, right, is that Rivian's vehicle is a rolling computer. It has more technology in that vehicle than any on the road, and any Tesla even. And every ECU, the TCU, telematics control unit, right, where you get up, we send updates back and forth, real time over the air updates and things. Every part of that vehicle is potentially, if you get into it, to be hacked, right? If you can get through the TCU, kind of the top of the control module where the vehicle receives and sends data, the risk there is incredible. Obviously, the obvious one people think of, them braking or somebody steering you off the road. That's first and foremost safety, but then the data that's on the vehicle that they could take, right? People are now putting credit cards out there. You've got the vehicle can renew subscriptions. You can bank off in your vehicle through your phone, through your vehicle. People don't just want to hack vehicles because they want to they're bad actors, but don't want to hurt people. They want to steal information, right? So it's a constant concern. It was a huge thing to think about at Rivian and all the automakers, anyone who's doing anything over the air, especially. And then the other part of that equation is, right, so there's a concern of theft, the data in transit, right? So a Rivian vehicle at some point in the future is equipped to take a terabyte of data off of each vehicle a day. So when you're at Amazon, they can literally, when it's up and running in the system, if it proceeds as they think it will, can take a terabyte of data off of each vehicle, and it can send it in real time, or you can take it to an Amazon warehouse, plug it in, and download, offload the data. But in any case, any over-the-air transfer of data is susceptible to being intercepted, right? So it's a constant worry. I spend probably 40% of my time at Rivian on cybersecurity.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Britton, when you're working with your clients, are you worried about cybersecurity as well? Is that something that you're constantly worrying about when it comes to automation, robotics, and that sort of application? Oh, you're muted, Britton, you're muted.
We really have to be, but we actually have a team of people who is focused on that. And we bring them along with us for all of our meetings, all of our digital discussions, everything. And it's really part of the standard operating procedure that we have when we are bringing on new clients. We do these assessments, and we have to ensure that anything that we're working on in terms of cybersecurity, that it really is part of our standard operating procedure. We absolutely are looking at it in terms of the new projects we're doing. But the thing that we're finding is that it's becoming so much more complicated because of the fact we are talking to companies that plan on using autonomous vehicles, or they're introducing, new technology or new systems, or they're wanting to change their business models, or they really want to go big in digital. And now they're wanting to share much more information among companies. So yeah, it's a massive problem. It's a massive concern, but we have a team of, I believe, 13 individuals that specialize in that. So we finally just said, look, this is becoming so important and so critical that we needed to have a separate team. So we have an internal cybersecurity team that basically works with us on all of the projects.
That makes total sense. Well, that's the questions that I had. I'm going to turn it over to Grace. She's going to come up here in just 1 second. Again, thank you all for who are watching at home and for being part of this conversation. Again, thank you, panelists, for being a part of this. All yours, Grace.
Well, thank you. So happy we get to meet finally face to face. Hi, everyone. My name is Grace. I'm with Freightwaves. And quick plug, Lauren will be on my Sirius XM show later tonight. So if anyone's listening to that 5 to 7, she will be there. I was going to ask a question about data, but let's take a breather on that one for a quick second. I'm interested in your ESG initiatives, and when you're working with suppliers, it's really probably for Evelyn, well, really everyone on here, when you're working with suppliers, knowing that the government is pushing a lot of these environmental standards, how are you implementing that into your conversations with suppliers, especially when it comes to more of a scope 3 type of emissions that are definitely more harder to handle and harder to really grasp for a lot of those smaller companies?
Sure, and we have a global team that is focused on environmental, social, and governance criteria. I focus particularly on the supply chain as it relates to that, but as you imagine, we have investor relations. We have the emerging European regulations that are really more aggressive than the US right now. We know that there is some, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, for instance, was just passed, but there's more to come. The SEC hasn't fully sort of pronounced how this will be viewed in the future. But from my perspective, it's a big focus right now. We talked a little bit about the integrity of the supply chain and ensuring that, not just, we talked about cobalt or other source, the sourcing and origin of, precious metals and things that go into our products. That is that's a big push to make sure that we can know end to end what's in our supply chain. And we partner, for instance, the Responsible Business Alliance is, Dell was a founding member of the Responsible Business Alliance, and we really are taking the lead in partnering with many of our competitors, really, to make sure that we're being top of mind in terms of what we need to do with supply chain integrity, with human rights, and all the other criteria that sort of flows from ESG criteria. And so I'd certainly say to the students that are listening that that's an area that is, I don't think it's going away. I think it is stakeholders and stock owners are really focused on making sure that end to end we have integrity within the supply chain, and it's a hot topic for me that I focus on daily, really.
Yeah, I can tell you that in my experience with Rivian as a manufacturer, they used recycled bottles. They had a company that compressed them into racks and stacks in the warehouse. So they were completely 100% recycled ocean plastics. The dashboard that they're working on, one of the things they're working on, always everything there was about sustainability that was looked through that lens. There was a team of people there who that was their job, 4 or 6, I don't know how many there are now, but that was their sole job, was to, hey, talk to procurement, you want this dash material, can we find a responsible source, an alternate source, some way that they could, this company, evaluate them on reusables in the materials that they have, their wage and labor, their human rights and that type of thing. So from that perspective, Rivian was all over that and dedicated time and resources. So it's one thing to talk about it, and then we'll talk about consolidation too, where you have times now, I think, where companies focus on it and they're so willing, and it's important enough to them to ask and look for partners in this, right, to reduce costs, but also to check each other. And, in the auto industry, at least, that's really unheard of, right? I mean, I grew up here in Michigan. They would rather went out of business and work with Ford to produce a seat, right? I mean, that was not going to happen at any level, let alone on a sustainability level. And you see this cooperation, like Evelyn mentioned, from these major companies like HP and Dell and such to work together. And that's, I think, very encouraging. And to your point, it's not going away. I agree.
Correct. And the only thing I would say is that, very similar to what Michael just mentioned about Rivian, we have a very detailed checklist that we have for all ESG activities. We have a legal team that's focused on that. Our cybersecurity team is also part of that organization. And it's just one of the things that we're frequently audited on these things because we do a lot of business with food companies. So the FDA, Food and Drug Administration is involved in this, the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA. We have a lot of audits that we go through, our clients go through. So yeah, I agree with you. This isn't going away anytime soon. And it's just one of the things where our philosophy is, we know we have to do it, so we have to be bulletproof. And we just simply have that attitude, and it's helped us very well.
Awesome. Now we're gonna bring it back to data. Lauren,
I
I
can jump in on that too. So ESG, so environmental, social, and governance. I like to kind of identify the alphabet soup. So two different areas that I would say for certainly kind of the ocean side of things. Funding coming out of Department of Transportation and the Maritime Administration. So the administration, Biden administration, has made it very clear that they want to see more diversification in where the funds are going, but they also want the applicants of the grant funding to show that there's going to be some positive environmental impacts. There's going to be some positive diversity impacts. They specifically outline historically disadvantaged communities as areas that they want to see some of these funds for these port infrastructure projects and what have you. I mean, there's millions and billions of dollars coming out of the Department of Transportation to help this area. And then also digitization, going back to that I was talking about earlier, there's a push to have better visibility in where the products are sourced and not just on the actual company saying where the products are sourced, but there's some platforms out there that are going to be providing that service so that you can actually go through and see, well, where was that cotton farmed? What specific farm was it? And then you can then research that farmer and see what practices he uses, and all without having to go through whatever product company it is. But it'll be part of, their intention is it's going to be part of that platform that any user can hop on and go check. And, that's where your shirt came from, and that's where the cotton from that shirt came from. So, I think that there's an overall move without it always being formally identified. But I think that there's some more, just responsible consumers that want to know more about what their products contain.
Yeah, just add to that real quickly. The other part of this too is you don't want to be embarrassed as a company, right? You want companies to do the right thing and have good great social responsibility. But I talked about cobalt a little earlier. If you look online, Amnesty International did a report about cobalt production in Congo. And I think it was 6-7 years ago now. I think that spurred a lot of interest in doing things the right way with cobalt, that it hopefully has trickled out, or hopefully like a flood, to other areas. And I think as a community, as a globe, we're more concerned about that. But on the other side of that coin, they specifically called out automakers and said, you are buying from this mine and these people are being treated this way. And that opened a lot of eyes. And unfortunately, maybe for some, it took that article to do it. Hopefully we're getting much more proactive and better about it. But that's how that whole cobalt journey started. Blissful ignorance is not an excuse. So hopefully as we go through this, more people will open their eyes, and they are opening their eyes and looking. And it's a great thing think about the obverse of that. The great thing for a company to say, hey, 100% of this, whatever, came from recycled materials, in a low-income community. We're producing a low-income community, created 400 jobs for people in that area. I mean, that's not only good corporate governance, but it's just good human being governance, doing the right thing.
Definitely. Laura, this is probably going to be big for you, talking about visibility. And this kind of question was kind of asked about this earlier too. There's a lot of technologies out there that are looking to bring more visibility to the ports and their operations and help with a lot of the transactions when it comes to international trade. A lot of them have difficulty though in really eliminating the demurrage and detention issues though, because they don't have that visibility of when the ships get there. And I know ports are working on bringing their data more to the surface. The government's recently came out with their own data initiative, which I think could have been a little bit more, a couple more partners involved in that. But what are your thoughts on what drivers call more silo data that's stopping them from knowing exactly when to pick up and really keeping them at the ports for a while? Do you think that ports and along with large shippers, global shippers, do you personally feel like they're becoming more visible and open about sharing their data? And do you see a brighter future in that area? Really, anyone from the panel too can answer that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with, so, the ports don't necessarily even have that data, so I think that the ports would like to share that. So there are kind of two types of ports. There's the operating port and there's the landlord port. And so a landlord port is like LA and Long Beach, where the actual terminal itself is owned by somebody else. So when we talk about LA Long Beach, or let's say we talk about Long Beach, it's a creation of the city. So it's a quasi-government or it's a full government type entity, but then they're selling their space to the private terminals. Where if you contrast that with Port of Boston, they're an operating port, so they own and operate. So that's a creation of the state, quasi-government. And so, so do they have the data? Do they have this data that they can then pass on? Not necessarily. They get information on when the ships are coming in, but sometimes they might not even get that information until 24, 48 hours out when it's actually coming in. And so that's the same information that, maybe some of the shippers or some of the cargo owners are also going to be receiving. So it kind of comes down to the ocean carriers and releasing some of that information and the clear visibility and where the ship is and when it's coming in. And there are some ocean carriers that do put that information online, but not all, and it's certainly not kind of mandated to be standardized there. And I think we're getting there. And so, I'm encouraged to see the government try to take a little bit more active role here, but this is another plug for the Federal Maritime Commission. They did a study in 2015, identifying different areas of congestion, saying that kind of visibility of supply chain was important. But it was done by Commissioner Dye, who's on the Republican side, who didn't want the government to be that actor. She wanted it to be more of a private driven thing. And so then she created the supply chain innovation team. They looked through it all. Same thing. She was saying, we need a national data freight portal, but it can't be government. It needs to be private. And so now we're starting to see that a little bit more, in terms of detention and demurrage. Even the billing practices around that aren't really mandated and aren't really standardized. And so, you could receive a bill potentially 5 years later for your goods that came off the ship. So let's talk about demurrage. The cargo comes off the ship, sits on the yard. And then if you don't arrange for pickup, if you don't arrange for somebody to go get that box off the yard, you're going to get charged, and exponentially so, because it's all about incentivizing the movement of the goods. And so if it sits there for too long, it's just racking up these charges. Okay, fine. In the moment, everybody knows what's going on. 5 years later, you're like, what box? When? Like, what was going on? So the FMC is trying to step in and say, we'd love to see it within 30 days, 60 days of the actual detention or demurrage happening. You have to bill. And here's the different things you need to outline in that bill. You can't just send a bill for $5,000 and say that's it. You need to send a bill that says, well, on day 1 through 5, you were charged $75 a day. And on day, 6 through 13, you were charged $275 a day because we wanted you to get your stuff out of here. And so, standardizing, that's where the government has that role, is standardizing some of that stuff so that, it helps eliminate some of the bad actors. And it's not a strict like oversight to it, but it is a guardrail to it. Right now there's no guardrails, arguably. So like I said, you could charge $5,000 5 years later and you're like, I don't even, and like not even identify the cargo box. You're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And there's no way to fight that. And so, having the other regulators outside of the FMC, Congress in particular, understand that that's the world that you're playing in, is there's kind of no rules on it right now. And so the FMC is getting there incrementally. But yeah, I mean, so they're everybody buying into we need more visibility and understanding that we can mimic it after aviation. I mean, you have your big ticker sheet of what's coming in, what's going out, who's going where. There's no IP really. There's no like intellectual or business practices that are being released through that. So the sphere of visibility is going to somehow create competitive advantages, I don't think is well founded. And so I think we all are, as an industry, moving in that direction, the visibility piece. And I hope with the billions of dollars that the ocean carriers are enjoying right now, some of that money not only goes to, better ships, but it also goes to digitizing and better kind of equipment that they all need to make all this happen.
Awesome. Do we have time for one more? Is that good?
We close in minutes, so.
Okay, cool. Do you want to wrap it?
I can wrap it.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you all for watching. Professor Kennedy will do the wrap up, but if there's more questions for any of these panelists, please make notes to us. We'd love to re-interview them and talk with them more. We've just scratched the surface on some of these issues on law and supply chain. So thank you all for the panelists.
Yeah, I also want to thank everyone. This is great. It gave me a ton of things to think about myself. As I look at this area of practice, it's fascinating. It really does sit at the center of law, technology, and innovation in a lot of ways. I would think that your work almost every day almost requires innovation. I love talking with supply chain lawyers because they really start to understand the actual practical potential of things like blockchain, about simple smart contracts, these sorts of things, and how we need to start thinking about them. And we also see where the choke points are starting to be. So that last mile is really interesting. You say, is it going to be self-driving? Is it going to be self-walking robots? Is it going to be a person on an electric cargo bike? And the answer is probably going to be all of those as we try to optimize with what we do. And you also have, pirates, big ships, drones, all these sorts of things that can be part of what you think about on a regular basis. But I think there's also, for me, in the practice, so when I was at MasterCard, just to wrap up here, we sometimes looked at the supply chain and the sort of different platforms out there that payments were one part of what I'll call the supply chain OS, the supply chain operating system. And so if we say, can we make it possible to pay for things at different places in super easy ways or automatic ways, that becomes interesting. And we start to look at the supply chain and other things we do as an ecosystem. And then I think that changes your perspective as a lawyer to say, maybe I'm not doing one-on-one contracts. Maybe it's not like one deal after another. Maybe I have to look at the whole system. And I have to, as a corporate lawyer, I have to be embedded with the business team from the beginning. So I understand all these components, and there are tons of them: cybersecurity, data privacy, climate change, all these things. You really almost can't avoid them in this area of law. So I think it's a super fascinating area. And one that there's just going to be more opportunities. I think it's, I encourage people to go in this direction. We see people here at Michigan State, especially in the JD MBA program, looking into supply chain law, which I think is great preparation. We see other people interested in that way. And I encourage people to reach out to our panelists, to me, to Matt, of course, and kind of follow what's going on out there, both in the law and in the supply chain. And then I'm going to recommend this book called Arriving Today, that was written by Christopher Mims, who's a technology writer for the Wall Street Journal, and he followed a USB charger from where it was created, I think in Vietnam, all the way through the supply chain till it got to somebody's door. And he started writing the book about 2 weeks before the first pandemic lockdown. So that's an interesting overlay on it. But you do see the really interesting places where we need to focus and where there are going to be legal issues. And I think almost every place there's a handoff. There are really fascinating legal issues. So what happens when we go from, the autonomous crane to an autonomous truck to something else? Can we really do paper contracts anymore? Doesn't have to be something automated. How will those things work? And I think that's an opportunity for lawyers to have really creative, interesting roles for a long time. And I think that's, to me, will be a lot more fun practice than the outside law firms, doing research on force majeure clauses for us and trying to determine whether because Russia is calling it a special military operation. Does the contract clause apply? Which is interesting, but it's not as interesting as trying to make this whole supply chain work better and do really innovative things in law. So that's my wrap up. And like I said, we can reach out to everybody, and we just so much appreciate everybody who helped us put this on, and everybody who attended. And the recording will be made available. So look for that and recommend it to your friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, and thanks to the Law College. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and go green.
Go white.
Yeah.